last lesson, we looked at Carolus Linnaeus and his classification system. We talked about how organisms are given a genus and species name, and that makes up its scientific name. And the classification system that we use today is based on those contributions of Linnaeus. But today's classification system uses a series of many levels to classify organisms. So even though its scientific name still comes from its genus and species names, there are several levels of classification before you get to genus and species. Now, this is going to sound a little bit complicated as I start reading through this key sentence, but we're going to look on the next page at how this kind of breaks down, so bear with me for just a second. But it tells us that the domain is the broadest level of organization. So that means it's the most general level. There are lots of different species within a domain. And then within that domain, there are kingdoms. Within kingdoms, there are phyla or phylum. Within the phyla, there are classes. Classes are broken into orders, orders into families, and finally, families into genus and then to species. So the order is that you have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And the more levels that two organisms share, the more characteristics they will have in common and the more closely related they are. So let's look at the next page and kind of break this down. I think it'll make a little bit more sense. So we saw that the most general category is the domain. So for example, there is the domain Eukarya. And these are some examples of organisms that you might find in that domain. You can see that some of them are not very closely related at all. This bird is not very closely related to this mushroom, but they are all in the domain Eukarya. And then we start to break them down. So we take some of those organisms and place them into kingdom Animalia. So as you can assume, the kingdom Animalia would be all animals, which means that then we can get rid of plants, we can get rid of fungi, we can get rid of protists. They're going to go in a different kingdom of their own. Then we break it down and we go into phylum, Chordata. Chordata means all animals that have a backbone. So you can see that we now have eliminated insects and worms. And then you just continue to break these down so that the closer you get to the bottom, the more closely related those organisms would be. Remember, the scientific names comes from these last two, which is the genus and the species name. Remember yesterday that it is written in, or in the last lesson, sorry, that it is written in italics. The genus is capitalized and species is lowercase. So this is its scientific name here. So as you move down these levels of classifications, the organisms that are left at each step are more closely related, and you are dividing those others out and putting them into other kingdoms and other phylums and other classes in a whole different pattern to get to whomever they are. This would be similar to, you are a very specific, unique person within my class. So as we to work through one of these examples for you, it might be that, up here, we might just say all students in the Vigo County School Corporation. Then this might be all students in any middle school in Vigo County School Corporation. Then any student at Woodrow Wilson Middle School. And then any 8th grader at Woodrow Wilson Middle School. And then any 8th grader who has Mr. Sloan at Woodrow Wilson Middle School. And then anyone who has Mr. Sloan during 5th hour. Anyone who has Mr. Sloan during 5th hour who sits at the middle front table. Anyone who has Mr. Sloan during fifth hour who sits at the middle front table in the right-hand seat. So you can see how we started at a very general, very broad category, like all students in Vigo County School Corporation. But by grouping these out and basing things on similarities, we eventually get down to this can only be one person who sits in that seat during that hour at that table in my classroom at Woodrow Wilson at a middle school in Vigo County School Corporation. So that's how we use these levels of classifications. Now, in order to, for us, now that the species have been identified, if we find a species and we want to know what it is, we use a tool called a taxonomic key. And taxonomic keys are useful tools that help determine the identity of an organism, and it basically consists of a series of paired statements that describe a very specific physical characteristic. So each step will only have two choices. One of those choices will be true, and only one of those will be true, and then it will tell you what to do next. So you will basically start at step one on a taxonomic key, and you will read your two choices. So let's say that we are looking at this organism. We start at step number one, and we read our choices. Does it have 8 legs? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I believe it has 8 legs. So then we do what it says, which is go to step 2. So now we go down to step 2, read the first choice. It has one oval-shaped body region, or it has 2 body regions. Looks to me like it has only one oval-shaped body region, so we will go to step 4. So that means we skip 3, we go down to step 4. Is it less than 1 millimeter long, or is it more than 1 millimeter long? And it tells us right here that it is 0.4. So if it is 0.4 millimeters, that means that it is less than 1 millimeter, and we're told that it is a mite. So this is how you do a taxonomic key. You just start at step number 1, you read your two choices, one of those will be correct. It will either tell you to go to another step and choose, or it will identify what the organism is. So I would like for you to go on over to the taxonomic key on page 21 and work through those 6 organisms using the taxonomic key on page 20 that we just used. So that blue key on page 20 that we just used to identify the mite, use that same key, start at 1 each time, and see if you can identify those 6 organisms on page 21. And just write those names into your book, and we will check them when you are with me this week. Alrighty, thanks for listening.